Thanks very much. Well, it's an honor to be back here again, or at least the first time, I guess, in this building. I've been to Heartland several times before, and I always admire the work that's done here. And I've known Joe, I guess, obviously, for decades, so it's great to be here. I guess the reason why I wrote this book was I was very concerned about the permanent damage that Obama's doing to this country. And I think there's some places we're probably over the brink. I think there are other places where we're not quite at the brink yet. And so I wanted to and write a book that would kind of explain the permanent damage that had been done, but also kind of go through and say where I think things can be still fixed. And I think one area where the damage is probably permanent, and I don't think we're going to be able to fix it because the president's going to be in there for another 3.5 years, is health care. I mean, we've seen huge changes in just the last 4 years in the research staffs for places like Merck and Pfizer, where you've seen 50% or so cuts in research staffs. We've seen during the first 2 years that the health care regulations were affecting private insurance. We've seen almost about a 1% increase per month in the premiums for private health insurance. And my concern is that America clearly has had the best quality health care in the world. Often I think the way the president and others have talked about this in the past by just looking at total life expectancy has been very misleading, because Americans have a lot of risks in terms of things like, we get into auto accidents at much higher rates than others. We're relatively obese. Those are not the types of things that healthcare can kind of overcome by itself. But if you were to simply ask the question, if you were to get sick, what country in the world would you rather get sick in? What's your chances of surviving getting sick there? It's very clear that the United States would be hands down the country that you would want something like that to happen if it had to happen. And that, as I argue, not only for the insured but also for the uninsured. People often think that just because that's the same thing as them not receiving health care. And in fact, if you look at the data, you in fact find that the uninsured in the United States have been fairly happy with the quality of their health care. And in fact, the uninsured are about as happy with the quality of their health care as Canadians are with the government. People insured are even much happier. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the health care thing, in part because I only have a half hour to talk to you guys. And I think there's some other topics I'd rather get into. But I just want to say, I go through not only health care, the impact that Obama's had on the economy, on gun regulations, but also taxes and regulations more generally. But I thought I would start and talk about, whoops, that didn't work too well. Help. So, here we go. Okay. There we go. Oops. I guess we do have the healthcare stuff here. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the economy right now. And one of the reasons why I did the economy is to go through the debates we're going to be doing with the budget. We just dealt with the sequester, dealing with the debt ceiling limit increase. And the president, I know what arguments he's going to make. Everything from saying that if we pass the debt ceiling increase, we're going to face default. Obviously, most people should know is false. But the other claim that he makes all the time is that if we even slow the rate of government spending after this huge, giant increase that we've already had, that's going to hurt the economy. And so we can't really cut government spending. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, here's a guy who in 2008, it's almost impossible to believe right now. You almost have to go back and read the debates and his speeches. But this, if you read the 3 presidential debates or look through them, particularly the second and third, one thing that he said he's been promising throughout the campaign, and it's true, was he was going to cut the net size of government. He criticized Bush for letting government grow too much, and that he was promising at the end of the Obama administration, government would be smaller than when he got in there. I think he missed slightly on that. But, and then of course, immediately after the election, we started talking about the huge stimulus that was there. but that was only going to be for 1, maybe 2 years. And of course, now we're 5 years into the administration, and we're told not only back on that stimulus, we can't even slow the rate of growth of the federal government. It's economic catastrophe if something like that were to happen. You know, as an economist, and I know there are other economists in the room, I learned in college, and you know, you just have the basic notion the money has to come from someplace, where it borrows, or whether it taxes, or even if it prints up money, you're really just transferring wealth from one place to another. You're not creating new wealth. And some of these notions, just hearing today, the president making a statement when I was listening to the news this morning about how important food stamps and other welfare programs are to stimulating the economy, because these people go and spend more money. At least the way I always learned it was that in some sense all the money gets spent. If you go and get your paycheck and you put it in the bank, some of it you write checks on, you know, to go and cover your mortgage or your car payments or your food or your kids' education. But the rest of the money that's in the bank just doesn't sit in a vault someplace. The bank goes and lends it out. And so if the government were to go and tax you another $1,000 and you were to take that money from your checking account and give it to them, that just means that bank has less money to go and lend out. It just means the money's been moved again from one place to someplace else. It's not, you're just changing who's spending the money rather than changing the total amount of money that gets spent. Now, but as I said, I want to go through and kind of talk about, you know, what the arguments are the president's going to be making for why we have to have a big increase in the debt ceiling limit. But just talk about kind of where we are right now before I get into that. And you can look at the percentage of job growth in jobs during recovery since 1970. The average recovery over the first 44 months has seen a growth in jobs is about 9.5%. After severe recessions, you have much faster job growth, and over the first 44 months, it's about 12%. After mild recessions, the growth is about 5%. Well, here, we're about 2.2%. You know, so we're like a quarter of what would be the normal job growth rate during an average recession, recovery after a recession since 1970. But even that, I'm argue, really kind of misunderstates how bad things are. And there are two things to look at here. One is this has been the first recovery where the number of jobs people hired per month during the recovery is actually lower than it's been during the recession. You know, obviously, I don't need to tell you, during recessions, people don't hire as much. It goes down. And you can see the number of hires going from about 5.2 to about 4.4 million jobs a month. During the recovery that we have here, it's gone down to about 4.1. And if you just look at the last 3 months, it's about 4.25. So it's still slightly lower than the average during the recession. Well, if we're hiring so many fewer people, why do we have any new jobs there, new net jobs? And the easy way to think about this is you have essentially two things that are going on. You have hires and you have quits. You can kind of think of like the water level in the pool. You have water coming in and water going out. The water coming in are hires. The water going out are quits. The only way you can get the water level to go up when you're putting less water in is if you're taking less water out than you used to. And so what's happened is we've had another unusual phenomenon, and that is, well, hiring's gone down during this recovery compared to the recession. Quits have fallen even more. Now that's really perplexing for most economists, because what normally happens when a recovery starts is quits soar. And it's particularly true after you've had a long recession. People, during a recession, people are afraid to quit their jobs because they're worried they're not going to get a new job someplace. And so when you have a long recession, and you have kind of more and more people kind of built up who are not happy with the job they're at, but they've only stuck with it for a long period of time because they're worried about what the alternative is. When you've kind of built up this large overhang of accumulated people who normally, if it had been a regular economy, would have quit at some rate, but you've accumulated them, you usually get a huge increase in quits after when you have recovery. But you can see here, quits have fallen. And as I say, they've actually fallen faster than the drop that we've seen in hires. That's the only reason why we've had even this small increase in net jobs that are there. You see a similar pattern to the hires. It's basically fell during the recession, fell further during the recovery. It's gone up a little bit now in the last 3 months, but it's still below the quit rate during the recession. And this is phenomenal that you're having fewer quits now than you did during a recession. It seems to indicate that a lot of people out there are more worried about the job market and their success in getting another job now than they were during the recession. So how hard is it to get a job? Well, one way you can look at this is just say, what are the number of hires? A lot of people who put graphs somewhat similar to this together will go and look at job openings. And I think that's pretty misleading because there's been a big difference over the last few years in terms of job openings and actual hires that are there. But if you look at hires and compare that to those who are unemployed and those who have recently left the labor force, you can see here we've obviously had, you want to have a lower number. That means hires as a percentage of people who are looking, in a sense, is relatively good. But here you can see here it's soared during the recession. It's come down a little bit, but it's basically stalled, and we're at a much worse level than we were, just 5-6 years ago. Now, there's another big difference with this recovery, and that is you can look at things not only in terms of how employment's changed, but also how income's changed. And there's something Milton Friedman, others have pointed out for a long time, is that basically when you have a recession or a depression, the economy has fairly quickly gotten back to what we would call the old trend rate, kind of the normal rate that the economy has been growing. This is the first time we haven't been, and I'll show you the graph in a minute. But you can see what happened during the Great Depression. There's a very large drop in GDP, but it sprung back fairly quickly. The only reason why it took as long is there was kind of this, what they call depression within a depression, where Franklin Roosevelt basically thought that the greedy banks were hoarding money, and so he dramatically increased the required reserves that banks had to hold. And there's a reason why they were holding them, is that because they had been promised earlier that the Fed would act as a lender of last resort. In 1913, they were stopped from restricting how much money they could pay out to people when they would demand their deposits be returned to them. And in exchange for that, the Fed promised to loan money to temporarily tide over banks if people tried to withdraw a lot of money at one time. Well, the Fed didn't honor its promise. I won't go through the whole story. And so they didn't trust the government, and so they wanted to keep a lot of extra reserves there just as a cushion. And Roosevelt felt that that was the reason why the economy wasn't recovering as quickly as he thought he did, so he wanted to punish them by essentially requiring them to give more money to the government, and it was a mess. And I won't go through the whole story. I'm happy to in a question period. But you can see there was a little bit of a dip here, but pretty quickly went back to the old trend and ended up getting up to where the old trend line would have been by the time you get to about 1940. And you can see here, this is during the 70s and 80s. You can see the recession during the 70s, the drop, kind of get back to trend. You can see the Carter recession, the drop, get back to trend fairly quickly here. And you can see now during the 90s and this last decade, here's where we are now. I haven't put in the last couple quarters in here, but the last couple quarters have basically been flat, almost completely flat. And so the gap actually has continued to get larger and larger. This is where we are now. That's how it compares to every other time. You can't find another previous recession and recovery where the actual gap between kind of trend GDP and how we're growing during this recovery has been getting larger. So you can just see how dramatically different, these lines are between these cases. Now, presidents argued we got to keep spending more money. That's going to stimulate the economy and create more jobs and what have you. And I've kind of shown you a little bit on what we have, our own experience has been over the last few years and compared it to past recoveries that we've had. One thing I think is probably more useful and is to go and compare how we look at compared to other countries. And to see those that have kind of followed the advice that the presidents had or Paul Krugman's had or others, and how well they've done. So one thing is to look at just government spending. The ones that have had the biggest increases in government spending, how have they done in terms of employment? And the graphs here are pretty striking. The ones that have had the biggest increases, so I've had this lagged, because it's the change in the previous year, looking at employment later on. I can do a year by year. I've graphed in the book, and also regressions where I have the year by year change across all these countries, and I have economists, for those here to know, I'm control for fixed year and country effects. But you can see the countries that have had actually negative growth in government over this period of time, like Switzerland, Hungary, Israel, Poland, Germany just very slightly. Their real growth has pretty much been close to zero. Those are the countries that have done fairly well. The countries that had the biggest increases in government spending, haven't done too well. You can look at it in terms of GDP growth, a very similar relationship. The ones that actually saw a shrinking of government as a percentage of GDP have done fairly well, and those that had the big increases later on experienced the worst GDP growth. Now, Krugman has a measure that he's used in the New York Times where he goes and kind of detrends it from normal growth and GDP, which is fine. But what he does is he starts the data in 2009 and looks on. The problem that you have there is that the big growth in government spending is already occurring between 2007 and 2009. And in fact, many of the countries, and the reason why you get slightly perverse relationship from what he's looking at is that many of the countries that had the biggest increases in growth actually saw slight retrenchments in 2009 to 2010. So, he's ignoring this huge run-up that you already have. And if you look at over this longer period of time that we have the data for, and essentially do what he does, you get the opposite results from what he's reported in the New York Times. You can see with regard to GDP growth, and you can also see this measure of austerity and employment. Now, one of the, it's almost become like the Bible for the Obama administration, has been this book by Reinhardt and Rogoff, basically saying, this time is different. It's the claim, one of the claims in the book is that recoveries after financial crises are slower, take longer to recover than it would be after non-financial recessions. And so, when you read their book, it's kind of absent of a lot of statistical tests and what have you, and they admit that there's some arbitrariness in terms of how they classify countries. I didn't want to really get into a debate with them about how to classify countries, even if I had disagreements. So what I decided to do is just take their list of countries that they said were in financial crises in 2007, 2008, and just look forward to see how they've done. And so we have the two sets of countries here. The dashed line are countries that Reinhardt and Rogoff labeled as not having financial crises, and the countries that they said did is the solid line here. And this is just as in terms of labor force participation, right? And you can see here one reason to look at this as opposed to, they use unemployment and for the earlier times that they looked at. And it's actually kind of disappointing because unemployment's measured quite differently across different countries. And in some earlier stuff I showed that if you actually used a common measure of unemployment across different countries, you actually flip their results. But I think an even better measure, and one that you can get across a lot more countries, is just the labor force participation rate that's here. And at least for, there's lots of reasons why labor force participation can change in the long run. People want to stay home with their kids, or, other things that are going on. But just from year to year, short-term changes, it's hard to explain that, and surely not with the large group of countries that we have here. And you can see here that if you look at these two groups of countries and just look at what's happened in the labor force participation rate, it's pretty hard, at least to me, to see a difference. And if you do look at statistical significance, in fact, you don't find a difference when you look at all of them. It's more interesting, though, if you break it down and you say, okay, if you look at the countries that they said were facing a financial crisis, it turns out that there's really two countries, Ireland and Spain, that are just incredible outliers. They're basically, this is what happens to them. If you look at the other 10 countries, other 8 countries that they said had financial crises, it's a solid line right here. And basically they're flat. It's hard to see them suffering a worse recession or somehow them having a slower recovery. Here's the for the United States, and then this is going to be anyway, you can just see here that basically it's hard to go and say countries suffering financial crises as a whole suffer worse recessions and have slower recoveries. It's really just 2 out of these 10 countries that they have that's basically driving that result to make it similar to the other countries. In fact, so here is, okay, so this is for the United States, and this is for the countries that, for the financial crisis as a whole. I'm just breaking them down. Okay. Now, so I just want to just summarize here before we get into the next topic, and that is, as I said, part of what writing this, because I think we still have a chance to try to reduce spending and to control it when we have this debt ceiling limit increase. And we're going to be hearing that we're going to be destroying the economy if we don't increase the debt ceiling limit, because it's going to stop government spending. And you can see all the stuff that's going on right now. I've been having to fly this week. And, with the air traffic controllers, I mean, obviously they're the first things you lay off when you do something. And also the way you lay them off is particularly insightful. You want to have, rather than having kind of a low percentage over time, you just say, we're going to lay off a lot of, furlough a lot of people in this place this week, and then we'll furlough a lot of people in this other place here at this one time, rather than kind of, a low percentage all the time. So you just, I'm sure so everybody can appreciate how important these things are. But, I suppose the other option is just say, well, okay, you can't run this, so we'll just privatize the air traffic control. That would be one thing to do. But anyway, so I just hope this type of argument, this type of data takes away at least a couple of the arguments that the president's making, both why we need to increase this. And there are other graphs that I have in the book that I think are pretty powerful. One is just to compare the United States and Canada. Canada had a very different policy than we did in dealing with the recession. They didn't have this huge stimulus, and to the extent that they had a stimulus, a lot of it was just to reduce tax rates. With Obama, we had some cut in taxes, but what happened was they were cuts in average rates, but increasing in marginal rates. And the way you do that is you go and you increase like deductions and credits, but phase them out then as people's income goes up. So the reason why your effective marginal rate's higher is because not only do you face the normal 15 or 25% marginal rate, but since you're losing some of your credits and deductions as you go and earn additional money, the effective tax rate is much higher that you have there. And it's kind of the opposite what economists would normally teach their students to do, where if you want to, it's the marginal rate that's important for incentives. And if anything, the lower average rate would, the way it works, would also reduce the incentives to work. But they didn't have the huge increase in government spending. And one of the things that's interesting is that I would argue that the huge increase in government spending that we had actually increased unemployment. And the way to think about this, we had not only the stimulus, but we had 4 jobs programs. When you add all those things up, you're talking about $1.3 trillion. When you move $1.3 trillion from where you and I would have spent it to where the government thinks it should be spent, not only are you moving those resources, but you're moving the jobs that are associated with those resources. And the problem is people don't instantly move from one set of jobs to another. And so just by creating this chaos, you're going to be creating unemployment. You can just see in the book where I map out the change in employment in Canada and the United States, how they both were moving in lockstep right up until the time when we started our stimulus. And as soon as we started our stimulus, our unemployment kept on going up, and theirs basically leveled off, and we got the big gap. And as soon as our stimulus program kind of ran out of steam, out of money, then the gap between the two countries started getting closer again. But so anyway, another thing that I think the president's having a big impact on is gun ownership, and I think it's much broader than kind of people focusing in terms of the federal laws that are going on. When I started the book tour for At the Brink, the first state that I went to in February was Colorado. And the big news the day before I got there, I was invited by both Democrat and Republican state legislators, was that the White House, in particular Vice President Biden, had been calling up Democratic members of the state house, lobbying them to go and vote for the gun before the state house at the time. And one of the bills that they felt particularly strongly about was this tax on the purchase or transfer of guns. And apparently what had happened was, according to the legislators I talked to, was that Vice President Biden had called up and had said, look, this is really important to us. It's important that a state like Colorado, which is considered relatively gun-friendly, pass this. And if you vote the right way on this, the president promises to help you campaign next year. But if you vote the wrong way, then the White House is going to help find candidates to run against you in the Democratic primary next year. And I'm not saying anything's wrong with that. I'm just saying it's a level of intensity about the gun issue and almost any issue that I know of, for a White House getting involved in state politics. I've never really, it's one thing to go and play hardball like that for congressional races or for U.S. Senate seats or whatever, but to get involved in state legislative races and state house races in a state like Colorado is just unprecedented. But again, it just shows the intensity with which this administration feels about the gun issue. And one of the things that was interesting, they got 7 members of the House to switch their votes, which was more than enough. It made the difference in terms of the outcome of the votes. One of the 2 laws that ended up passing, as I say, was to put this tax on the sale or transfer of guns. Republicans had 2 amendments. I had some involvement with them. One was to put a cap on what the tax could be. Republicans proposed a tax limit of $35. Democrats voted that down. We still don't know how much the tax is going to be. The other amendment that was put up was to exempt people below the poverty level from having to go and pay the tax. I mean, my research on guns convinces me that it's basically the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And unfortunately, that's one well-defined group in our society. It's basically poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas who are by far the most likely to be victims of violent crime. And it'd be great if the police were there to protect them all the time. But unfortunately, they're not. And the question becomes, what do you advise someone to do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves and the police aren't there to protect them? And I think having a gun is by far the safest course of action for somebody to take. We can get into that debate if you want. But the point here is that who's going to be stopped from buying guns because of these taxes? Who's going to be most affected? It's basically going to be these poor blacks who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. It's just not in Colorado. We saw Maryland, which is another state that the White House got deeply involved with. They basically lobbied the president of the state senate there to go and switch from opposing the taxes and fees that they're having on guns. In Maryland, I don't know what the final cost is going to be because, again, it's one of these bills that got passed where some of these taxes and fees are to be determined at a later date after the bill passes. But if you just take the taxes and fees that were in the bill, it's going to cost you $350 to license and register a handgun in the state of Maryland. And again, who do you think is going to be stopped by having that $350 fee? We have $534 to go and register and license a handgun in Washington, D.C. If you include the training costs here in Chicago, you're probably talking about several $100s. Of course, Cook County just put another $24 tax on it. 25. So, these things add up. You may think of each little tax or fee, the Floyd card's $10, other things that are there to get a license in D.C. Chicago's like $100 or whatever. All these things began to add up, training costs. And if you look at the data for Chicago, basically the only people who have gotten licenses, there's only been a few thousand for handguns, are basically well-to-do white people. And in D.C., that's definitely the case. And, so you have to go and ask, why is it? In D.C., there was at least somebody who tried to raise an amendment to try to make it so that poor people would be exempt from paying all these $500. Nationally, if you look at polling data, basically, gun ownership is fairly invariant with regard to income. High-income people own guns at about the same rate that relatively poor people do. You look at the data for Chicago, it's like incredibly skewed compared to the national stuff that's there. You basically have people who live in zip codes where the median family income is $120,000 have handgun licensing rates that are about 6 times higher than people who make about 40 zip codes where the average family income is $40,000. So, and that's not what you see nationally. And at D.C., it's even more pronounced. Of course, they have even higher taxes that are there. So now there's been a lot, just this last week, they had the big votes in the Senate, and I suppose it just drove me up the wall because Democrats were constantly making false claims about background checks, and even many of the Republicans were getting it wrong on this stuff. This first one's mainly something that the president has been pushing, but if you read the New York Times or other things, you would have seen this lots of times. In fact, there was a 10-day period in January where at least once a day the New York Times had at least one story where it made this claim. About 40% of all gun purchases are conducted without a background check. He's continually making it even just up to a week before the vote this last week. Well, here's the problem. And as you'll see with a lot of these things, it involves what you might think is a simple change of words, but they're pretty profound meaning. The White House will point to a 1997 study published by the National Institute of Justice, and one of the authors is actually now at the University of Chicago. But what they looked at was transfers. It's a pretty horribly done study, but I'll just give you the outline here. They claim that 36% of transfers were done without background checks. The president rounded up the 36% to 40. That's trivial. But he changed the word transfers to sales. There's a huge difference between transfers and sales. The vast majority of these transfers are within family gifts or inheritances. So almost all of it is. For some reason, I don't think it would have had quite the emotional impact if the president said, look, there are too many parents they're giving their kids rifles for Christmas presents, and it hasn't been sufficiently regulated. For some reason, I don't think that would have had quite the same emotional appeal to people as saying 40% of sales. Now, this survey looked at 251 individuals who had obtained their guns between November 91 through either November or December 1994. There are a couple things to take into account. One is that the Brady Act itself didn't even go into effect. This is a federal mandate for background checks, didn't go into effect till the end of February 1994. And there's another important difference that's there, or two others I'll just mention. One is, well, you can't even just assume the sales are uniform around this period. Plenty of people here were around during the early 1990s. And you may remember gun sales soared before the Brady Act went into effect. And then they basically collapsed through the floor after the Brady Act went into effect. So if you just assume it's uniform, it's like 80% of these sales would have been beforehand, but it's probably well over 90% occurred before the Brady Act went into effect. The second thing I'll just mention is that who's been selling guns has changed a lot over time. If you look at the data for 92 and 93, there were about 284,000 federally licensed firearms dealers in the United States. By the end of the Clinton administration, it was down to about 100,000. That 184,000 change was basically the elimination of what we call so-called kitchen table dealers. People would sell, half dozen guns a month or whatever from their home. The big thing about being a federally licensed dealer at the time is you were allowed to buy guns wholesale and not just retail, so they pick up a few dollars by doing this. But here's the problem, and that is the survey is asking people whether they thought they were buying from a licensed dealer, not whether they actually were buying from a licensed dealer. And I've talked to enough of these FFLs at the time to indicate that if you're somebody who's selling a gun from your home, it's not like they had a big sign in front of their home that says federally licensed gun dealer lives here. There's no reason when you talk to them that they would think that most people who are buying a gun from them would have any idea whether they were a federally licensed dealer or not. People might think if they went to a brick and mortar store, a regular store that was selling guns, Walmart or whatever, that they would know that they were a licensed dealer. But there's a good reason to believe that a lot of these sales, they might have thought they were just buying from a neighbor who wasn't a licensed dealer. If you just ask the question that the president's been saying and just look at sales, what you find is that about 13% using this data didn't think that they were buying from a federally licensed dealer. My guess is it's probably would have been well in the low single digits if you'd taken account the problem that I just mentioned that was there. Now I just give you quick numbers. If you look at inheritances, about 93% of gifted guns come from within families. About 91% of inherited guns come from within families. So you get an idea of these transfers, how much they're just from families. Now there's another thing that's here. Just mentioned the president's upped this now to about 2 million. He basically says that if you look at the Brady Act, there are about 2 million dangerous people, in recent quotes, who were stopped from obtaining guns because of federal background checks. Schumer and Leahy make other similar comments. Here's the problem. The way they should actually phrase this is to say 2 million initial denials. There's a huge difference between saying initial denials and saying dangerous people prevented. And I'll just give you a simple example. You may remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy. 5 times he was on the no-fly list. 5 times he was initially denied being able to go and fly on a plane because apparently there was somebody else out there who the government really did want to stop who had a similar name to him. Okay? And so would the president count that as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? I presume not. But essentially, maybe in a car, but I don't know, being in a plane here, whether that would be the case. And so the issue that you have here is we're essentially counting all these initial denials as bad people we've stopped. And look, Ted Cruz has made this mistake, Lindsey Graham, Paul Rand, and I've talked to their staffs, and their staffs all know that this is not right. So like Lindsey Graham has said multiple times, he said 8,900 fugitives were stopped from buying guns because of background checks, and he goes after Obama, and these other guys have gone after Obama for not prosecuting these people who were stopped. Well, there's a reason why they didn't prosecute them, because they really weren't bad people. It was somebody who had the same name as a fugitive. But just because somebody has the same name as a fugitive doesn't mean you go and count them as a fugitive you stop from buying a gun, or a name that's similar. Okay, I see. So let's see what we got here. Can I go? Yes. There we go. All right. So I'll just give you the numbers for 2010. And there are about 76,000 initial denials. There's 4 stages of review. I'm going to take 2 minutes more. There are 4 stages of review. And 94% of these cases are dropped at the first stage based because of false positives. There's a survey that was done in 2004 of the next stage where they still found almost a quarter of the cases that remained were still false positives. So that gets you around 95% or so. And but we don't have any more detailed information than that. I personally believe it's probably much higher. But if you take those 76,000 in this year, what you found is only 62 cases were referred for prosecution. They declined to prosecute 18 of those, so they only prosecuted 44 out of 76,000, and they got 13 convictions. You look at the 13 convictions, these are not really bad guys. It's amazing when you actually read the cases here. I'll just give you one quick example, and that is one case, there's a 65-year-old guy. His wife had gotten threats. He decided he was going to buy her a gift of a handgun so she could have it for protection. And but apparently, 45 years earlier, he had gotten into a fist fight in his front yard with his brother. And neighbors had called the police. They had been arrested. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor domestic violence charge. And he claims, I don't know if you've ever bought a gun, but if you do, there's this 4473 form you have to fill out. Have you been dishonorably discharged? Other things, have you had certain prohibited offenses that you've been convicted of? Anyway, he didn't fill this in as being a prohibited offense that he would have been stopped from buying a gun from. He claims he didn't realize it was a prohibited offense. Prosecutors argue there's no way he could have forgotten this and that he must have known when he read the description there that it would have been a prohibited offense. And so he was convicted of perjury, basically 3 years in jail. But those are like the 13 cases. A lot of them, maybe that's the most egregious, but you run into a number of them that are like that. And so here's the deal that we just have to think about, and that is everybody wants to go and try to stop criminals from getting guns. But what's been left out of this discussion is any type of notion of trade-offs. Look, when you have 2 million people who should have been able to buy a gun basically but are stopped, there's a lot of those guys, I would argue, it's an inconvenience. But when you're dealing with such a large number, you're going to deal with a small but significant number of people who may have really needed to get a gun quickly for self-defense and may not have had the luxury of waiting a few months or 6 months or whatever to go through the process that's there. And so here's the trade-off. How many criminals are we stopping versus how many law-abiding citizens who need to get a gun quickly for self-defense are we stopping? Now, it's not just the people who we catch in the net, the criminals, but it could be we inconvenienced some and made them more difficult for them to get guns in other sources. There are lots of studies that have looked, haven't found reductions in crime as a result of this. There's some that find that even short waiting periods are associated with increased crime. And so I would argue that the net effect has actually been to make things worse. And here's the bottom line. The bottom line is, one, there's no discussion about these trade-offs when we're talking about these laws. It's just, can we do something to stop this? The problem is you can make things worse. When we talk about adding millions more names to the list, if we don't fix things like these false positives, you're going to create a lot more false positives out there. the likelihood that your name is going to be similar, not necessarily the same, but similar to somebody that they want to stop is going to be increasing the more millions of names that they throw on the list that's there. And so hopefully somebody's going to ask the question eventually when we talk about these things, what's the trade-off? What's the increase in safety? What's the loss in safety from these things, from changing the rules in different ways? And it's something that's been completely left out of this stuff. But I think somehow, and I'm worried that these issues aren't going away. Nobody did a very good job of educating people on these things. One of the reasons why I wrote this part of the book was to hopefully give people some facts and information when the gun debate was coming up. And it's hopefully, since it's not going away, it's hopefully something that will be around there to help people in future debates on this issue. But anyway, I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to go and answer questions that you might have.
This morning I saw the interview with Piers Morgan, and I was...
Which one? I've been on his program like 5 times or something.
I saw one of them, and
right.
I thought you were extremely polite and well, and he's not, and I just wondered what your thoughts are on Piers Morgan, why he's still on TV.
Well, I mean, I think he believes that by behaving the way he does, he'll attract attention and build up an audience. What I can say is his audience is probably the most rabidly anti-gun of any of the audiences on shows. I mean, when I've been on there, you would not believe the hundreds of angry emails I get from people. And it's very lopsided, the emails that I get. So I know he's playing to a group of people that are out there. And, so he's giving them what they want to have. And, it's not a lot of them. He's not doing well compared to the other shows. But, 600,000 people that watch regularly his show, or 700,000 or 800,000 sometimes. And, I face a trade-off in my mind about doing those shows. I think, well, it's not like the most pleasant way to spend an evening in the world, but but I just hope that I can get across a couple points that wouldn't have gotten across otherwise, and I think I'm different than most of the other people he's going to have on who are going to be arguing Second Amendment type stuff. That's not the way I argue these things, and and I think if he comes across boorish, I actually get a few emails from people who say I'm strongly in favor of gun control, but I have to say that, Piers Morgan's behavior offended me or whatever. So I figure he does some damage that way too. Yeah.
With respect to the economy, and when you were talking about employment, I wanted to find out whether or not you believe or what your view is when they talk about technology's impact on employment and there being a skills match, because you keep hearing that there are thousands of jobs out there, but the people who are unemployed don't have the skills for them. And then my second question is the role of government now with respect to influencing or setting pay for bankers, because the Fed just came out and gave the approval to some of the larger banks that they want them to cap their compensation.
Well, I think the government should micromanage everybody's pay.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that's a pretty simple one to answer. So, as far as the skill sets go, it's interesting when you look across the age distributions there and see who's been hurt the most. You basically have 2 groups of people that have been kind of suffered the most from this. You have young people who are just entering the job market, and then you have people over 55 who lose their jobs. And people over 55, a lot of them are very skilled people, but the market's changed, money's moved around, other types of job skills are in desire right now, and their old jobs aren't coming back. And the problem is when you're 55 or 60, it's not like you have a long horizon there to go and get retraining that's there. And the companies aren't going to retrain you, and it's not in your interest to go and spend a lot of time doing it. And so what you find is people in that age group are seeing that their next best alternative compared to what they used to make is a lot lower wage than they got before. And a lot of people in that age group are just retiring early or taking huge reductions in salary, but they're taking a long time before they've convinced themselves that they really can't get another job that's similar to what they had previously. And so you had a lot of people who were very highly skilled in a sense, but it's just their skills are not in demand right now. And now for the people who are just entering the workforce, I mean, you've probably seen some of the data on college-educated people who are like under 25. People in the broad middle, I went through the quit data and the hiring data. Hiring's gone down, but quits have gone down too. Well, people can kind of maintain their jobs if they already have a job. But if you're just entering the workforce for a first time that's there, it's not like you have a job that you can go and hang on to at that point. And so, if you add up the people who are kind of unemployed under age 25 who have a college degree, plus those who are working in jobs where a college degree isn't considered a requirement for doing it, like working in Starbucks or what have you, you'll get numbers, it depends on who's measuring this, but you'll get numbers that are in the mid 40s to low 50% range that's there, which is pretty phenomenal levels that are there. But, we've had a lot of change. I've talked about kind of this churning, government moving resources around, other things that are changing. And, it may take a little while for people to go and move and develop the new skills that are there. I'm not really sure that tells me that there's any role for government to go and do that. People, I think, probably have a better idea of what types of things they're interested in and what types of skills are going to pay off for them than having it some centrally planned type thing there. And so, I would just tell the government to stop creating all this chaos where, all these regulations, all this spending. The regulations, you look at things like Dodd-Frank, where banks aren't allowed to offer a lot of financial services that they didn't previously. That's a very high-skilled area. Now, some jobs, Goldman Sachs, which supported those types of regulations, they've kind of picked up some of the slack. They may have hired some of the people that used to work at these banks doing these financial services, but other people have just left the industry. So, we've in healthcare and other things, I think a lot of the regulations that we have just helped create this kind of mismatch between, people who have carefully developed certain skill sets over time and what types of skill sets are disfavored as a result of the regulations that we have. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, the lady there.
Thank you so much for coming out today.
I'm glad you can have me here.
One of my frustrations are as a result of some of the changes that you talked about, the regulations and the Obamacare and all of that. All of the people many of the people I know who have voted for Obama are now being affected by reduced, maybe they're laid off, they got a new job, and that job, those hours are being cut because the employers don't want to be paying for, or, the hour restrictions.
Right.
They seem to be content and looking for government to solve their problems, whether it be from a food stamp card, a telephone card, a Medicaid card, whatever that is. And my sense is, and I could be wrong, is that the nation as a whole, whether it be younger people or older people, are very content going towards this
Right.
bigger government taking care of all of our problems, just like in Western Europe.
Right. Well, it's an interesting point you bring up. Look, to me, maybe one of the more depressing things is that they don't seem to blame Obama for the fact that they're having these fewer hours of work. To me, people were predicting this beforehand. It was pretty amusing, at least somewhat amusing, I guess. I don't know, about a month and a half ago or so down in Brazil, who ran Al Gore's campaign. Anybody who watches CNN has seen her on many times. She was complaining on the TV about how she just gotten a new bill for her health insurance premiums. Had gone up by like 18%. And she'd called them up demanding an answer for why they were being so greedy and trying to just go and increase her health insurance premiums all of a sudden. I wonder if she'd been watching the news or something over the last couple. Here's the deal with the, just as a simple economist, kind of the simplest take on these types of regulations. If let's say you're running a business and I come up to you as a consultant and I say, look, I can tell you how you can run your business so that you can offer your customers a lot more services, and because you're offering them these additional services, it'll cost you less money. Would I have to force you to take my advice? My guess is you would pay me to do that, to give you that advice. And yet, obviously the government's having to force insurance companies, yelling and screaming, and others to go and adopt these policies that they want them to do. And so that should be the first tip-off that maybe it's not going to accomplish what you think. If it really was so wonderful, great, more services and going to save costs at the same time, lower the cost of health insurance, we would have to fight them not to adopt these rules. And we see the layoffs, we see the reduction in part-time, people moving to part-time workers. And, somehow we have to communicate to people better that, look, if you penalize companies for having full-time workers or having more than a certain number of full-time workers, it's not too surprising. They like to avoid the penalties that are there, and they'll do things like cut the hours of people so they're not considered full-time workers so they don't have to pay the penalty on them. Doesn't seem like to me it takes a rocket science to figure that out. But somehow the people that are doing this, because the president, obviously, he just has his automatic rhetoric where he goes and he blames the greedy insurance companies that are there. One of the things I'll just mention, and I go through a little bit in the book, I don't know if you remember this, but during the healthcare debate, the president was explaining why the government would be better at running health insurance than private companies. And his big reason that he gave was that he said, look, you have the cost of running the system, but then private companies have to tack profits on over and above these costs, whereas the government doesn't have to go and earn these profits. And so the government can naturally go and run health insurance more at a lower cost than private companies because they don't have to add on the additional profits that are there. Now, anybody who's been involved in business understands that the whole point of profits is to give you an incentive to lower costs. There's a reason why all the companies in the United States are not for profit, right? I mean, if they really were having this big advantage that the president claims exists, then why is anybody for profit making sense? Particularly with the tax subsidies that the not-for-profits get. And but somehow we have to educate people to understand that, look, this is what we were predicting was going to happen. The opposite of what the president predicted was going to happen. He was predicting all roses with regard to lower costs and people being able to keep the programs that they had and what have you. I'll just give you one amazing number. Right now, the average cost of private health insurance for an individual is like $5,400. Come January, assuming the exchanges get set up, the cheapest price that you're going to be able to get insurance for an individual, the so-called bronze plan, is going to be $7,100. That's just between now and January. I mean, people have sticker shock over the last 2 years that we've been seeing these big increases since the program went into effect. Just wait until next year. For a family of 4, the cheapest insurance that you're going to be able to buy on these exchanges is a little bit over $20,000. And this is after the increases we've just had over the last 2 years. So I'll just show you a graph here. You look at, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a consumer price index, obviously, but they break it down by components. And if you just look at their health insurance premium component, the rates had actually peaked in kind of mid-2007, fallen until around the beginning of 2011, which is when the Obamacare health insurance premium regulations went into effect. And this is where they've shot up since then, and they continued to rise. So this is hardly bending down the cost curve that the president was talking about. Anyway,
Time for one more question?
yeah.
What do you think Obama really meant when he said he was going to fundamentally transform the United States? And do you think that the Cloward-Tibbins strategy is part of that?
You are asking a rhetorical question here. So, does anybody have another question? We just did another fast question here.
One number we never hear in all your research on guns. What is your estimate of how many lives are saved by law-abiding citizens owning?
Well, I mean, I have data on things like right to carry laws. I would argue for concealed carry, you'll see murder rates reduced about 1.5% for each additional year that a right to carry law is in effect for about the first 8 years. So, find the murder rate in the state that you want to look at, and that's a rough thing. Now, it varies a lot based on the different right to carry laws. Huge differences in right to carry laws. There's differences in fees. You have they can be as low as $6 for a 5-year permit in South Dakota, to $140 in Texas, or even higher in New Mexico. You also have differences in length of training requirements. About a quarter of the states don't have any training requirements. And you have some states that are as high as 10 hours for both training. And those things affect the number of people who get permits and the amount of deterrence that you have. And it also affects who gets permits. So when you have a higher fee, not only do you reduce the number of people who get permits, and so you have less deterrence, but what you also have happen is that the mix of people getting permits changes. You basically have more white male suburban types who get permits, and they're not the ones who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, and you don't see the biggest drops. So, if it were me, one of the things that I would do is adopt a rule that would have low permit fees, as low as you could get them, maybe even zero. I mean, the benefits from concealed carry are for the population generally. It's not clear why we should make the permit holders pay anything. Pay for it out of general revenue. And have as minimal training requirements as you can.